following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Welcome to Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Claire Hall, and I'm really looking forward to today's program. As you know, if you're a regular listener, I talk with many interesting people about many interesting things, but I keep returning to my favorite subject, the great American sport, baseball. And it is a particular pleasure to welcome as my guest today Marty Appel, a man who is really associated with, in my opinion, and I imagine you share it, the premier franchise in professional sports, with apologies to the Montreal Canadiens, the Boston Celtics, the Green Bay Packers. The New York Yankees just represent sustained excellence like no other franchise in sports history.
That would be true, I suppose. I mean, it's a remarkable run when you consider that starting in 1920, they've been such a formidable presence in American sports. There have been some gaps where they didn't win championships, but they were always interesting and compelling, and I've had a happy life being associated with them.
And, I think it's a remarkable story, so please share with us. I think you may be the only person I've ever run across who became a Yankee fan because he saw them as the underdog.
Well, I was only 7 years old. The Brooklyn Dodgers beat the Yankees in the 1955 World Series. I was living in Brooklyn, and I was living in Crown Heights on the second floor of a brownstone on St. John's Place, and you hear about people dancing in the streets. Literally, that's what took place. I looked out my window at the age of 7 and saw these people beating makeshift drums and literally dancing in the streets. So instead of feeling connected to that, I felt terrible for the losers, the Yankees, and became a Yankee fan out of that with a feeling of rooting for the underdog. So in that sense, Claire, my whole life has been a mistake.
But a happy mistake, would you agree?
Oh, yeah. I mean, a lot of going to sleep feeling good than not. But really, I should have, being born in Brooklyn and kind of old enough to understand the 55 World Series, I probably should have become a Dodger fan at that point.
And yet, if you had given the Dodgers your heart, you would have lost your team only 2 years later. So
that's right. They would have broken my heart, and who knows the psychological effects that would have had on me.
Yeah, well, reading your memoir, Now Pitching for the Yankees, I really get the sense you're about a decade older than I am, but, if we had grown up at the same time in the same place, we might have been kindred spirits, following baseball almost obsessively, reading the sporting news every week as a Bible, studying the original baseball encyclopedia by Turkin and Thompson. So talk about maybe your growing passion for baseball, beyond that 1955 World Series, and what eventually led you to applying for a job with the Yankees as a college student.
Well, can't say enough about the importance of Mickey Mantle in the 50s. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was the golden boy. I mean, he had the looks, he had the presence, everything about Mickey Mantle you just wanted to embrace. And I know to people who didn't root for the Yankees, he was the enemy. But for the sport in general, my gosh, to have Mickey Mantle as your cover boy was a wonderful thing. So clearly I was drawn to Mickey Mantle. I had pictures of him in my bedroom. And he was the perfect product for the game in the decade in which people bought television sets and fell in love with baseball through television. And he was in the World Series, people don't realize this, 12 times in his first 14 seasons as a player. Amazing. So he was as much a part of the NBC fall schedule as Bob Hope or, anybody.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Bonanza. So Mick was the poster boy. And after I matured and went to high school, went to college, It was while I was at college in Oneonta, New York, that I wrote a letter to Bob Fischel, the public relations director of the Yankees, expressing my interest in working for the team over my summer breaks. And I didn't even define what that job was I was looking for. I just told him I would love to work for the team. Well, this was the summer of '67, and by then Mickey Mantle was no longer taking home fan mail to answer it at night. It was just sitting there unanswered. And Bob Fischel knew that those were all going to be unhappy fans who didn't get some kind of a response. So he looked at the cartons and cartons of fan mail, and here comes my letter looking for a summer job. Perfect, right? So I have an interview, and I get hired to catch up with those cartons and answer Mickey Mantle's fan mail. And that gave me the opportunity to get to know Mickey Mantle while I was still a teenager, a remarkable thing. I remember driving home in the evenings and thinking, like, Mickey Mantle knows my name. What are the chances of that? So it was a perfect connection for me, for the Yankees, and it began a lifelong association, which still continues to this day.
Yes, and you worked your way into a full-time position, first as Bob Fischel's assistant, and then when Bob Fischel left the Yankees, you became the public relations director, and my gosh, you were there for what I imagine was one, from an outside standpoint, it certainly was, but you've got some great insights on what was probably, definitely a renewed era of Yankee dominance, but an era that was perhaps classically labeled the Bronx Zoo by Sparky Lyle, but George Steinbrenner, the owner, Thurman Munson, Reggie Jackson, Lou Piniella, I could go on, but from an inside standpoint, really, what were those years like?
Well, they were turbulent, and you'd show up for work in the morning and you wouldn't know what the day would bring, but you kind of knew you'd be on the back page of the Daily News and the New York Post the next morning. And they were challenging. They were not always easy public relations formulas to everything. Mr. Steinbrenner was in his 40s. He was volatile. He was determined to win at all costs, even if it meant shaving the corners here and there. Mm-hmm. And it was tense. Still, we were stealing the town back from the Mets. We were returning to the World Series after a 12-year absence. And we had larger-than-life personalities to deal with, so it was very exciting at the same time. I still remember watching one Saturday in 1978 NBC Game of the Week, Boston, and the great Billy Martin, Reggie Jackson confrontation in the dugout, and when you first saw that taking place, what's going through your head as somebody handling the team's public relations? Well, first thought was, this isn't good. This is on national television. And it still is. It gets replayed more than anything except for perhaps the Pine Tar home run.
Oh, yeah.
You just see it all the time.
Oh, sure.
And when you think of the personalities in the dugout there, besides Billy Martin and Reggie Jackson nearly coming to blows, there was Yogi Berra, there was Elston Howard, larger-than-life figures in the game's history, all involved in this awful moment. So it came, it passed, it became part of the Bronx Zoo scenario, but on we went.
Yeah, and you dealt with kind of the day-to-day turmoil, but one thing in your writing that always comes through to me is a real appreciation, perhaps would you say even a reverence for, that great Yankee history and the fact that this job as a young man gave you an opportunity not only to get to know the contemporary Yankees, but people who had been part of the franchise, part of sports at that time, as going back into the 1920s, who were still alive. And, for a true fan and student of the game's history, that must have been quite a thrill.
As you get older, I always had this appreciation for history, but your perspective on it changes over the years. For instance, this year is the 50th anniversary of the Miracle Mets, the great 1969 team that upset everybody and won the World Series. So, I mean, I can remember the 69 Mets winning the World Series like it was yesterday, but it was 50 years ago.
Me too. Yep.
Now, in 1977, when I was still with the Yankees, that was the 50th anniversary of the 1927 Yankees, maybe the greatest team in history. But I was young, and there was nobody in the organization who said, we got to honor that team this year. It's their 50th anniversary. Mm-hmm. So it kind of went ignored. And that's just the perspective of getting older and the years bunching together faster, so that 50 years now seems a lot different than 50 years then.
I can appreciate that. Hey, let me ask you something else about kind of Yankee mystique. One of the famous lines, I don't know if Roger Kahn said it first or he was quoting somebody else, that rooting for the Yankees is like rooting for U.S. Steel. But then I remember another author who did a great book about the 27 Yankees saying that rooting for a team, comparing a team that through the decades has produced the likes of Babe Ruth, Lefty Gomez, and Yogi Berra, comparing that team to U.S. Steel is simple-minded. So...
well, it was a catchy phrase, and it still exists somewhere out there when people want to talk about the corporate approach the Yankees may sometimes appear to take. But really, the personalities take it far beyond that easy sentence. Yep. When you start with Babe Ruth, who is as uncorporate as they come, and he's the foundation on which one could say the team still exists today. Mm-hmm. Because even today, and you can't say this for Bryce Harper or Manny Machado, but you could say for a lot of people, playing for the Yankees is a dream to wear that same uniform that Babe Ruth wore. Mm-hmm. And I think that still has meaning today. And the fact that they've never really changed the uniform is all the better. But the impact and the importance of that franchise still exists in the minds of young ball players today.
Oh, one moment a few years ago that I really loved, and even though he got, I guess, kind of a slap on the wrist for it, was when David Wells wore an authentic Babe Ruth cap onto the field one day. I'm sure you remember that incident.
Yeah. Now, Wells was one of the few who really did appreciate baseball history. Mm-hmm. And he was kind of a renegade player in his own way, but he did love baseball history. Mm-hmm. It was my findings over all the years I was connected with the team that players tend not to have that appreciation. I mean, they know who Babe Ruth is, but if you asked them who came first, Mickey Mantle or Joe DiMaggio, you might stump a lot of them.
I suppose.
Yeah, but they were busy playing while we were busy reading the baseball encyclopedia and the backs of baseball cards.
Yep. Well, to continue on the theme of colorful characters associated with the Yankees, one I haven't mentioned yet, but he was the subject of your most recent book, and, I should let people know if they haven't come across your work, you have a whole shelf of wonderful books about the Yankees and some of the key personalities in their history. And 2 years ago, you published a wonderful biography of Casey Stengel. And before, I ask you to talk about it, I just want to preface, kind of a two-part question. An awful lot has been written about Casey Stengel through the years, including, wasn't it about 30 years ago, Robert Creamer's wonderful biography. So, why did you want to write about Casey, and what led you to believe that you could bring something new to the subject, which, by the way, I really believe you succeeded at masterfully. But take it away,
Thank
please.
you. The answer really begins with my editor at Doubleday suggesting the project, and my initial reaction was that my friend Bob Creamer wrote such a great biography of Casey in the 80s that it's often cited as one of the best baseball biographies ever written. So not only was he a friend, but it was an intimidating assignment, and I wasn't sure I wanted to take it on. But then, as it turned out, and I thought it through, when Bob Creamer did his book in the 80s, he didn't have access to something called the Internet yet. And I discovered that there was a lot to be discovered by just combing the archives of all the little local newspapers in cities where Casey played and managed. So that was a terrific breakthrough for me. And then Casey's family said, would you be interested in an unpublished memoir, a full, complete memoir, written by Casey's wife, Edna, back in the 50s? And I was like, well, yeah. So that had all the information about their courtship, their marriage, their life together, and what a tremendous find that was. So between the two things, the digital archives of old newspapers that weren't available to Bob Creamer and this unpublished memoir by Edna Stengel, I really had a wealth of new material to work with.
That's great, and the book, I think got a pretty good critical reception, and it's really an enjoyable read. And Yankee history, of course, talk about your, monumental history, to coin a phrase, not necessarily to make a pun, but Pinstripe Empire. It's really the one book that I've come across. There's lots of books about various eras of the team, but there you kind of have captured the whole sweep of Yankee history from before their dominant era right on through to the present.
Thank you. I'm very proud of that book. It came out in 2012 and was updated in 2014. There had not been a full narrative history of the Yankees since Frank Graham did one in 1943. And as a book collector and a Yankee historian and as a fan, I was well aware of this. There have been some nice photo-driven books over the years, but nothing narrative that captured their complete history back to 1903. So I took on the task, and it was a labor of love. It was a little depressing when I realized that my first year as a fan, 1955, was before even the halfway point of the team's history. Yeah. But from then on, it was all stuff I had lived through. So my own memory was sort of driving the outline. And the challenge for a historian when you're doing a book like that is really the daily decision-making of what goes in and what's left out. So you are, in a sense, anointing things as worthy of a history and some things as not, which is a big responsibility. Mm-hmm. You might finish a chapter on the 50s and realize, I never once mentioned such and so-and-so, a ball player. Mm-hmm. And you'd say, I got to correct that. He belongs in the history of the Yankees. So there was this constant editing of my own work just to make sure that all the names that belonged in the team history and all the big events that got into the team history were there. And then it was embellished with personal encounters I had with players or with funny events I came upon through research. And, Bobby Richardson, who was their second baseman in the 60s, remains a great friend of mine, and he would sometimes point things out to me that I'd never heard before, and it would send me off in a direction of researching that story. Mm-hmm. So with a lot of help from a lot of great people, the book came out, was wonderfully received, and I'm very proud of that one.
As you should be. So we were talking about the era of the Bronx Zoo, and could you maybe pick up your story, kind of some of the highlights, leaving Yankee employ at that time, and yet, doing a whole wide variety of public relations work, but coming back in a different role of association with the Yankees as well.
I went on to become their television producer
mm-hmm.
for their local games on WPIX TV in New York. And as executive producer, I was Phil Rizzuto's boss and his sidekicks. So here was a guy who I grew up watching play ball and then enjoying his broadcast so much, and now I was his boss. And I'll tell you a really wonderful memory with Phil Rizzuto was he was retired when he got into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. And I realized that at long last he had made it, and the press was going to just descend on his home in New Jersey on the day of his election. So I called first thing in the morning, and I said, I'm coming over. I'm going to handle the mob. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't even sure he needed help, but by the end of the day, it was apparent that I was really able to help him and Cora Rizzuto out, just sort of filter through the interview requests and get through the day. And at the end of the day, Phil and Cora invited me and John Moore, our television director. Just the four of us went to dinner at this little Italian restaurant in New Jersey that he frequented. And I was sitting there just saying, I'm having dinner with a man on the day he went into the Baseball Hall of Fame. What a thing this is. So I never lost that little boy glow, even though I had been his boss for a number of years.
Oh, that's wonderful. So talking about the Baseball Hall of Fame, and you had an association with the Hall for many years, correct?
Yeah, it was always special to me, the Baseball Hall of Fame. I first visited as a kid in 1962 when it was in its original building, its original kind of uninspiring displays. But I always felt a strong connection when I went to work for the Yankees. I always made sure they got appropriate memorabilia, like the pen that Catfish Hunter used to sign his contract in 1975. And I always enjoyed my connections to the officials at the Hall of Fame. There came a time, I think starting in 1979, that for 21 years I contributed to writing the plaques that go on the walls in Cooperstown. And I wasn't the only one doing it. They would just kind of send me a draft version, and I would make suggestions and contribute to it. So when I walk through the Hall of Fame plaque gallery now, I can see particular sentences that were mine or suggestions that were taken by me, which is a really magnificent feeling, let me tell you.
Oh, I imagine. Well, how about a line you contributed to Bill Veeck's plaque that I think is wonderfully sums up Bill Veeck, but you kind of helped solve a problem, so to speak. But you know what I'm talking about. But I think sharing that with the listeners.
Yeah, that's like my favorite of all the 21 years. Bill Veeck is famous for sending a midget to bat when he owned the St. Louis Browns. But that's kind of something that keeps you out of the Hall of Fame. It doesn't get you in. So what to do with this little tidbit from Bill Veeck's career was the challenge. And I made the last line on Bill Veeck's plaque, a champion of the little guy. So I think we covered a lot of bases with that little sentence. And it's unlike any other plaque there. It doesn't have a summation sentence like that. And I'm very proud of that one.
Oh, I love it. So, again, when I think about the Hall of Fame, I would be interested in your perspective. Just as a lifelong baseball fan myself, I see more passion associated with fans talking about who does and doesn't belong there. For instance, a lot of people seemed puzzled or even angered by the choice of Harold Baines earlier this year. I think, my personal opinion is he belongs, but I'm a fan of a big hall. Well, on Facebook, I participate in a lot of baseball groups, but one of them where I'm the administrator, it is, seeking the ultimate honor for my favorite player and manager, Gil Hodges. And, the passion for people who have been hoping, for close to 50 years to see Gil in the Hall of Fame, to me, is kind of wonderful and kind of amazing.
I'm with you on that. I kind of believe Gil Hodges belongs. But as I'm asked about Thurman Munson, who I was close to, I'd love to see Thurman Munson in the Hall of Fame. But I also have an equal respect for the voting process. And I'm not going to always agree with it, and I might vote for somebody and somebody else wouldn't. But at the end of the day, when you come to Hodges and Munson, they both had their 15 years of eligibility with the baseball writers who saw them on the field day after day after day. And they fell short. They didn't make it. And for me, I've got to respect the process. They had 15 tries, and they didn't make it. And so for a later committee to put someone in who failed all those years, I don't know, it just rubs me the wrong way. And I say that even though I'd love for Munson, my guy, to be in. I'd love for Hodges to be in, especially because of what the '69 Mets did and how those players felt about him. I don't think Harold Bain should be in, not necessarily off his performance, but he had his chances and he didn't make it. So I'm torn on some of those, but that's to be expected. Some guys you'd vote for and some guys you wouldn't.
Well, Marty, we're coming near to the end of our half hour together, and to wrap up the program, I'd like to just make it author's choice, a baseball historical anecdote, story, maybe something you experienced firsthand, or something that you've learned about in your voluminous research, but something to you that maybe sums up your love of the game and why it is the greatest of all professional and amateur sports.
I think I would say just being in the presence of Yogi Berra as often as I was. So we're talking hundreds and hundreds of days that I spent with him when he was a coach for the Yankees and when he was presided over the Yogi Berra Museum, although he wasn't an officer there. It was just named for him. But any time you spent any time with Yogi Berra, not only did you remind yourself of what a sensational ball player he was, despite his appearance, despite expectations kind of being low. But also, this was what a joy to be in this man's company, who had such a wonderful outlook on life, lived such a noble life. There wasn't a day that went by when I wasn't sitting at the same table with him talking about something mundane that was in the news that day, when I didn't remind myself of being in the presence of a truly unique American hero. So that's what baseball means to me, Yogi.
That's wonderful. Marty Appel, a longtime New York Yankee public relations director, television broadcast producer, owner of his own public relations firm. It has truly been a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to be on Ask Claire.
Claire, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.